The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Welcome to the show. We have to start by talking about Donald Trump's convicted campaign chairman, Paul Manafort, who has been sentenced to only 47 months. You might remember he was facing 24 years. The recommendation was for 20 years. He got 47 months. And this is so representative of one of the biggest problems with our justice system. And there's lots of people on the right, when the left talks about structural bias, systemic bias, you have a lot of people on the right who say, find a specific systemic or structural bias, show it to me, and I will work with you to fix it. Well, let's fix our justice system, because that is an extraordinarily good example. The system works one way for people who are mostly wealthy and or well-connected and or typically white, and it works a completely different way for people who are mostly not wealthy, not well-connected, and not white. The maximum sentence for Paul Manafort was 24 years. The recommendation was for 20 years, and Manafort received 47 months despite multiple serious felonies, despite obstructing the investigation by lying after he signed a plea deal, which assumed his truthful and forthright cooperation. And the judge said, yeah, the crimes are serious, but he shouldn't be imprisoned until he's in his 90s. He's about to turn 70 years old, I believe, next month. So I'm giving him 47 months. He gets credit for the last 9 months, meaning he has 38 months remaining of a sentence. He does have to pay $25 million in restitution and a $50,000 fine. These are sort of sympathetic comments by the judge. He is sympathetic to the circumstances of Paul Manafort given his age and his deteriorating health. That's actually fine. If you believe that our justice system should be more sympathetic in general, I'm right there with you. But as many public defenders have pointed out since the verdict, including Rachel Marshall in a really good op-ed in the Washington Post, her clients don't get this sympathy. She has represented people who have been sentenced to life in prison for minor offenses, sometimes under what's called the three strikes law, for things like stealing pants from Sears to later return them fraudulently to be able to get a car seat for a child, okay? And under the three strikes law, they have been sentenced to life in prison. And when she has said to judges, consider the circumstances of my client, she has asked for that sympathy and lenience. And it's often poor clients. It's often clients that are not in privileged positions, sometimes histories of drug addiction, sometimes bad family situations. And she doesn't get that sympathy and leniency that Paul Manafort received for her clients. And not only that, her clients often have to sit in jail up to, through, and during their trials. Now, Paul Manafort eventually had to do that for part of the time once he broke his plea agreement by lying, but he was out on bail and able to prepare a defense as a result of not having to sit in prison. Manafort had that privilege, which many poor defendants don't get. So the problem here that I have is not that the judge was sympathetic to Paul Manafort specifically. That's great. We actually need a system that's more sympathetic. And I will agree with anyone who says, hey, you know what? In general, we need a more sympathetic and empathetic justice system. The problem is that the sympathy correlates with the power and status of the defendant. The problem is not specifically that Manafort got 47 months. The problem is that the max was 24 years. The recommendation was for 20 years. Poor brown-skinned defendants often get, if not the max, but the recommended amount of time. Manafort received 19% of the recommended sentence and only 16% of the maximum sentence. That's the problem. And over the last several years on the show, you might remember, I've been talking about the disparities in terms of how the law enforcement and justice apparatus focuses on street crime versus white-collar crime and corporate crime. And that's one inequality, but it's not the only inequality. Think back also, because now we're talking about high-level crime by people in positions of privilege or at least access to information. Think of Chelsea Manning. Okay, Chelsea Manning received a 35-year sentence for revealing evidence of crimes committed by the United States military via the leaks that she participated in, orchestrated. Consider again how we treat whistleblowers exposing criminality versus, in this case, a guy who has been committing crimes for a long time in Paul Manafort, directly connected to the highest office of power in the country, that of the President of the United States. That's also a disgusting inequality of the justice system, but maybe one that we will focus more on at another point. And then just as a reminder, this is just Paul Manafort's first sentencing. He's still scheduled to be sentenced in the other case, possibly as early as this week. So we'll be keeping an eye on that, and we'll see what kind of a sentence comes there. But on this first one, 47 months, far short, about 85% short, roughly, 80% short of the recommended sentence and 85% short of the maximum sentence. This is a system with structural bias, structural inequality. Let's get together with the conservatives who claim they want to fix those structural biases, and let's fix it. For whatever reason, they don't seem actually like they're clamoring to do it. Okay, this next story is so sordid and bizarre and so disturbing that I struggled with exactly how to lay it out for you in the simplest and clearest terms, and the clearest way is actually not chronologically, it's almost backwards and then coming back to the present. So last week or the week before, we learned that New England Patriots, the football team, the New England Patriots, the owner, Bob Kraft, was arrested for soliciting prostitution at a spa in Florida. And we know that Donald Trump is good friends with Bob Kraft. He said he was surprised and saddened by the news about Kraft soliciting prostitution. Okay. Then we learned that the spa massage parlor where this took place, which is now called Orchids of Asia Day Spa, has been implicated not only in prostitution, but potentially in a sex trafficking ring. Now, this is actually a sex trafficking ring. This is unlike Pizzagate or whatever else. This is actually maybe a sex trafficking operation, according to what authorities are saying. It used to be owned by a 45-year-old Chinese woman named Li Yang. And that's the second connection to Donald Trump for this story, because Kraft was busted there, and Kraft is Trump's friend. Li Yang used to own it, and Li Yang happened to watch the Super Bowl with Donald Trump at the White House recently. Okay, but fine, no big deal, because even though Li Yang knows Trump now, and she doesn't own the place, and she insists she never did anything illegal, her presence with Trump is mere coincidence. It doesn't really matter. Trump is in pictures with millions of people, as Sarah Huckabee Sanders has previously told us. Except that Li Yang has moved from running massage parlor spas to selling access to the Trump family to Chinese business people. Now Li Yang, who goes by Cindy Yang, I'll call her that for the rest of the story, she and her husband run a company called GY US Investments LLC. They've done that since 2017. And this is a consulting firm which helps businesses in the United States expand in the Chinese marketplace. But interestingly, they also help Chinese businesses make high-level connections in the United States. That starts to get a little bit more interesting. They have pictures of Trump's Florida Mar-a-Lago resort, and they list that they have activities for clients which include getting the opportunity to interact with the president as well as the Minister of Commerce, I'm guessing they mean the Secretary of Commerce, and other political figures, and they can also help you set up White House and Capitol Hill dinners. They are selling access to the upper echelons of power in the United States, including the closest thing we have to a royal family right now, Trump and his family. The day that this story broke all of a sudden, the GYUS Investments website stopped working. All of this material connecting them to Donald Trump has been pulled down off of the internet. We've been researching Cindy Yang, and it turns out that she's a member of the president's presidential fundraising committee. She donated a total of $60,000 to Donald Trump and to a PAC that supports him. Her Facebook page was filled with pictures of her and Don Jr. and Congressman Matthew Gaetz, who's a big Trump supporter, and Elaine Chao, the wife of Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, and Sarah Palin. Except that if you try to find that Facebook page now, it has also been taken down as the scope of this fiasco has continued to expand. And before the GYUS Investments website was taken down, it had a long list of events at Mar-a-Lago where you can mingle with Trump or his family members. Here's one such promotion saying that you can hang out with Donald Trump's sister. During the recent government shutdown, Donald Trump was scheduled to go hang out with these Chinese business people, but the trip was canceled over the shutdown, and Donald Trump ended up staying in Washington, D.C. But the business model here is very clear. The same woman who previously ran a massage parlor, which is now tied up in a prostitution sex trafficking ring where Bob Kraft, Trump's friend and owner of the Patriots, was arrested. They are selling access to Trump and his family. Here's a picture of Tang Hua, a president of some kind of automotive firm in China, with Eric Trump. We have a picture of Don Jr. with another Chinese business person in addition to Tang Hua. And before her Facebook page was taken down, Cindy Yang had multiple check-ins at the White House, at Mar-a-Lago, at Trump International DC hotels, at Trump's National Golf Course, at Trump Tower, New York City. It is stunning. So the headline here is that the person who used to own the illegal massage parlor where Trump friend Bob Kraft was arrested for soliciting prostitution is now running a business that sells access to Trump's family. This is a massive major story. If Barack Obama had been involved in 5% of this, on mere circumstance and suspicion alone, the right would be calling for his impeachment. But there are lots of other important stories here as well that go beyond just the Trump cronyism and corruption. There's a national security angle here. We know that there is significant Chinese infiltration with American businesses. And there are security concerns here. This is a story, of course, about crony capitalism, but it's also about how you can buy access to the President of the United States. But these Chinese consulting firms are so often mixed in with Chinese intelligence services, and being able to so easily buy access to the President and his family at Mar-a-Lago is a national security risk. And then lastly, with the massage parlor, prostitution, spa portion of the entire thing, there's also the story of the legalization of sex work, which is another issue which we've discussed before. But that's the story in its full scope. It requires a whole suite of new investigations, which we might get. But at this point, the investigative capacity of our institutions is stretched almost to the max. And I wonder whether there's even going to be a proper and full investigation into this. We know Republicans are under no urgency to do such an investigation. Let me know what you think about this. I'm on Twitter at @dpacman. The show is on Twitter at David Pakman Show, and I'll be back with much more right after this.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Today's new member of the day is Gary Richardson, and today's longtime sustaining member of the day is Ethan Slattery, who's been with us almost 5 years. Thanks to both Gary and Ethan. Join them at www.joinpakman.com. We got genuinely bad jobs news from February. As we often do in the first part of each month, we get the jobs numbers from the previous month. 180,000 new jobs were expected for February of 2019. The actual number, just 20,000 new jobs. 180 expected, 20 actual. This is 89% shy of the expected number. Still, jobs were created, so in a sense, that's good. It's better to create jobs than to lose jobs, but remember that the population expands. The number of people who enter the potential labor force goes up each month, so you need some new jobs just to keep up with population growth, and that number, depending on which estimates you look at, is 90 to 145,000 new jobs just to keep up with new people that are of working age. So 20,000 new jobs is actually quite bad. Now, just like I did under Obama, I don't play these partisan games where I either sugarcoat or exclude information that's positive or negative on the basis of the party of the person in the White House. I'm not doing that. The same way that under Obama, I made an effort not to over or understate the importance of any one number, I'm also going to be totally upfront with you that this is not a clear trend under the Trump administration yet. There's some wage growth, not much more than inflation, but there is some wage growth. That's good. The unemployment rate is still low. That's good, although we're starting to sort of learn about what the sort of other side of low unemployment it can be in terms of a very difficult labor market for hiring people. But when you combine a job creation number that's 89% lower than expected with a newly downgraded estimate for GDP growth for this year, which we just received, that's not looking great. I think anyone who is honestly assessing the numbers would admit. Now, that being said, not everything that happens now is because of Trump, good or bad. There's no sort of like one point at which we can say, okay, from now on, everything that happens in the economy, everything that happens with jobs, everything that happens with the stock market, it's now only attributable to Trump, or it's still attributable to the previous president. This is very complicated stuff. Over a full term of a president, you can probably start to say that most of what we're seeing is more than likely the result of the policies of the administration rather than the previous president. That's the reality. But it's better to just not play political games with this stuff. That's unfortunately how our media and political system works. And there's a really important thing that I continue to bring up. All of these numbers are constructions, the unemployment number, job growth, all that stuff. I don't mean that they are made up, that the statistics are made up. But what I mean is job creation as we measure it, GDP growth as a measure of how the country is doing. It's all a construction. We've decided that these arbitrary measures tell us how the economy is doing. We accept that they tell us how the economy is doing. It's circular and it has no sort of independent existence. This is not like a moral relativism or nothing has any meaning thing. It's just that we decide what tells us how to evaluate the economy, and then we accept that those are good measures for doing so. There is a really strong case to be made, as I've been making for years, that a lot of these numbers don't really tell us much about the overall well-being of people in the country. They don't tell us anything about the damage that we're doing to the planet in terms of climate change and pollution and the environment. They tell us nothing about how the mere idea of infinite growth forever is a destructive and literally impossible idea, because at a certain point you stretch the planet to the end of its resources. Within the context where we accept that this is sort of how we evaluate how the economy is doing, these jobs numbers aren't good. But more broadly, what I go back to every month when we get a new report about expected GDP numbers or job growth versus expected job growth is that we have to figure out what the relationship is going to be of humans to work and to the economy around them, because it's changing very quickly. It's not politically popular to talk about, but if we keep ignoring it, we are going to end up at some point, it's not exactly when, in what I guess is, to put it in an understatement sort of fashion, a rude awakening about the world around us. The numbers are bad, but we also have much bigger issues that aren't being dealt with here. Fox News host Tucker Carlson is really good at many things. And one of those things is couching what we all on the left suspect are really unsavory and disgusting political opinions as sort of rock solid, logical expressions of just where the facts take Tucker Carlson. And he does this so well that he's really good at appearing not to be a hateful conservative, but a compassionate one, someone who is led to conservative policy, not by pejorative beliefs about others, but because common sense and his desire for everything to be better for everyone has led him to be a conservative. That's sort of the character he's developed on Fox News. It's pretty transparent, but Tucker's really good at it, and it's particularly effective with the Fox News audience that he caters to. He makes the Fox News audience feel like he and they are right-wing, not because they're bad people or their priorities are wrong or they are ignorant, but for nice, fluffy reasons that everybody can feel pretty good about. Except we know that lurking behind that are the same disgusting, unpolished ideas that we see at Donald Trump's rallies and that we see outside of CPAC. And case in point, there is some recently unearthed audio which features Tucker Carlson straight up saying women are primitive and just need to be quiet and do what they're told. It's shocking, but it's really not all that surprising when you actually remember Tucker Carlson years and years ago and what his career has actually been. Both of these clips are from the Bubba the Love Sponge show years and years ago, but not so long ago that Tucker Carlson wasn't an adult with beliefs that he came up with on his own. Take a listen to the first clip.
You know what, in my brief experience, what gets women going is arguing with them.
Really?
Yeah.
Brad, I never use that.
It's true. You debate politics with a woman and just go, just full-blown out there, especially feminism. If you're talking to a feminist and she's giving you, men really need to be more sensitive and this. Actually, men don't need to be more sensitive. You just need to be quiet and kind of do what you're told.
And lighten up a little bit, bitch.
They love it.
And then we get to the part about women being primitive.
So, hey, let's go crazy. Wow.
That if it weren't my daughter,
that's one theory.
Well, I mean, it's I just can't, and I just think that's pretty unlikely.
Can you tell them, as outlandish as that is, how old is your daughter?
14.
Well, I love women, but they're extremely primitive. They're basic. They're not that hard to understand.
Okay, so now what, right? Well, Tucker Carlson has put out a tweet about this where he says, quote, "Media Matters caught me saying something naughty on a radio show more than a decade ago. Rather than express the usual ritual contrition, how about this? I'm on television every weeknight live for an hour. If you want to know what I think, you can watch." So opting not to do one of these bogus apologies, which people often do. I totally understand his reasoning there. And taking this as an opportunity to plug his show. So what should happen? I've been getting emails from people saying, David, are you going to call for Tucker Carlson's firing? David, are you going to call for an ad boycott of Tucker Carlson? No, I'm not. I mean, I'm not suggesting Tucker Carlson be fired for this. These are common beliefs among Tucker Carlson and a lot of people in his audience and a lot of the Fox News audience. Why would they fire him for merely reflecting what the views are of the audience? I'm not going to call for an advertiser boycott of Tucker Carlson. If advertisers understand that these are Carlson's views and these are the views of a lot of his audience, if they don't mind being associated with them, it's still probably a pretty good financial decision to advertise with Tucker Carlson. So I'm not calling for an ad boycott either. I'm guessing that a bunch of Tucker's new friends, if Tucker Carlson were to be targeted for a firing or for an ad boycott or whatever, would say this is another example of the triggered language policing left who are trying to get him fired just over jokes and it's censorship and free speech and blah, 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 First Amendment. Let's just all agree that we understand this is the underlying ideology here, period. The facade of the smart, logical, triggering the libs, non-ugly conservatism of Carlson, who's this great debater and has the moral high ground and the factual high ground, it's just fake, okay? He's just that. He is a facade for the exact right-wing beliefs that we know underlie their ideology, period. He doesn't have to be fired. Fox News probably is hiring him or hired him because of that, not despite that. If you go and look at the comments on articles about this leaked or unearthed audio, I guess is a better, leak doesn't really make sense, unearthed audio on Reddit and on the Daily Beast and everywhere that's writing about it, you will find the comment section riddled with people who say, Tucker is right. He should be applauded. There's nothing wrong with what he's saying. Women are primitive. They should just be quiet and do what they're told. There's nothing wrong with what Tucker is saying, and if you find it offensive, it's because you're a triggered liberal that can't handle the truth. So let's skip the Tucker should be fired. Tucker is exactly where he should be. These views and Fox News and Fox News's audience is exactly where this stuff all makes sense and is sort of harmonious. And it's just up to advertisers to decide whether they're okay with it. And if they are, it's going to continue to be profitable for them to advertise on Fox News. Evaluate Tucker on the reality of what he actually stands for, rather than this vague notion of a guy who has simply been driven by the facts to be a conservative. And then we can move on with our day and continue consuming the media that we find is useful or relevant to us. If you disagree with me, if you think we should be calling for his firing or for an ad boycott, let me know. I'm on Instagram at david.pacman. The show is on Instagram at David Pacman Show.
The David Pacman Show at davidpacman.com. Welcome back to the David Pacman Show.
It's great to be joined on the program today by Shane Dixon Kavanaugh, who is a staff reporter with the Oregonian in Portland. Shane, great to have you on, first of all. Thanks for your time.
Hey, thanks so much for inviting me on your show today.
So you've been working on this story, which involves university students from Saudi Arabia who have faced criminal charges in a number of different American states. This has also happened in Canada. And they've effectively disappeared. And the term disappeared can mean a couple of different things. It can be the good type of disappearance or the bad type of disappearance, I guess, depending on who exactly you are in the entire thing. How did this even first get on your radar?
Well, we started with just one case in particular that was a very big story at the time here in Portland, where a Saudi national, a college student here in Portland, was charged in the fatal hit and run of a teenage girl in a sort of popular part of southeast Portland. The Saudi government ended up bailing this individual out of jail, posting $100,000 so he could be out of jail while he awaited trial. And then weeks before his trial, he suddenly disappears. And this is a guy who was on house arrest, had an ankle monitor, and what have you. And at the time of his disappearance, that was a pretty big deal that a foreign national essentially skipped bail or vanished just weeks before his trial. Fast forward a year and some months, and I had learned while talking with a law enforcement source that federal investigators believed that the Saudi Arabian government actually helped this individual escape prosecution and essentially leave Oregon and the United States and return to Saudi Arabia. And the circumstances of his escape, the details were pretty remarkable. We learned that federal law enforcement assert that a black SUV came to this individual's house and picked him up, drove him out to a sand and gravel yard in East Portland where he sliced his ankle monitor and then drove off. Investigators believe that the Saudi Arabian government likely furnished this individual with an illicit passport since he didn't have one, and possibly got him out of the country or North America on a private plane. So learning just about that one case here in Portland was pretty remarkable. I mean, just the details of it. And then we started looking into this a bit more in Oregon to see, could there possibly be other cases like this? And within a few weeks, we found 4 other cases here in Oregon that fit the same type of pattern. Specifically, young men, students who were studying in the U.S. from Saudi Arabia, were on a scholarship program from the Saudi government, get arrested and accused of very serious crimes. So in the first case, we were talking about vehicular manslaughter, fatal hit and run. We're also looking at rape, possession of child pornography, felony DUI, assault. All of these individuals ended up disappearing before their trials, or in one case, before one individual completed his jail sentence.
So let's just cross a couple of things off the list if we can. The U.S. and Saudi Arabia don't have an extradition treaty, and there's not even the remote possibility that that's what's going on here.
Well, yes, it's true that the U.S. and Saudi Arabia, despite being longstanding allies, we consider Saudi Arabia an important sort of partner in the Middle East, and obviously we trade billions with them a year, manufacture arms and send them over there. They're one of the world's largest producers of oil, but we do not have an extradition treaty with Saudi Arabia, which means if a Saudi citizen here in the U.S. is accused of a serious crime or any crime, ends up leaving the U.S. and returning to Saudi Arabia, the Saudi Arabian government is not going to turn one of these individuals back over to the U.S. to face prosecution. There's a number of countries around the world that the U.S. doesn't share an extradition treaty with, and a number in the Gulf region. But for an ally and considered partner as big as Saudi Arabia, that's a little bit unusual that we don't have an extradition treaty with them.
So when we talk about the sort of disappearance, obviously you've pointed out the ways in which Saudi authorities in the United States might be involved, but would this be possible without some involvement or at least indifference from American law enforcement?
That's a really good question, and it's obviously one we've been asking since we've started looking into this matter. And at this point in time, it's not really known what role the U.S. has had, if any, in facilitating the departure of some of these students. And, I was talking about the cases here in Oregon, and it's worth mentioning that since finding the 5 cases in Oregon, we've started looking around the U.S. and in Canada to see if this was happening in other places. And so far, we've found cases like these in 7 other states and as well as Canada. And so, it seems to be a pattern that's been going on for decades. Have traced a manslaughter case back to 1988 in Ohio where this exact same thing happened, and prosecutors there. I talked to people who were involved in this case 30 years ago, and they, very directly stated they believe that the Saudi Arabian government helped facilitate this individual's escape. But in terms of what the U.S. involvement has been, that's not really known. But I think the other sort of question that we're trying to find the answer to is what has the U.S. government known and for how long? Because it seems very unlikely that somebody within the FBI, the State Department, the Department of Justice would not have known about a number of these individuals, foreign nationals accused of serious crimes, essentially vanishing without a trace.
I'm guessing the answer to this next question is sort of obvious because they are Saudis studying in the United States, but are we talking all about rich families here, people with access to money, wealthy people?
That's a question that's been asked a lot since we've been reporting on these cases, and it wouldn't be surprising to think that most of these kids came from sort of well-connected or affluent families in Saudi Arabia. However, I'll point out that the King Abdullah Scholarship Program, which has sent hundreds of thousands of Saudi students to the U.S. to study in the last 15 years or so, or actually more, about 13 years, it's been hundreds of thousands of people, and not all of them have come from particularly affluent or privileged backgrounds. I'll go back to the case in Portland that sort of got this whole investigation for us started. That defendant, his name was Abdul Rahman Nura, came from what is essentially a middle-class or lower-middle-class family in Saudi Arabia. He was raised by a single mother who was a school teacher. So that's not the type of individual you're thinking about when we tend to think about Saudi students who are studying in the U.S. So the scholarship program provides sort of full tuition and other perks for citizens from all backgrounds in Saudi Arabia.
What has the Saudi embassy had to say about this? I'm guessing you've spoken to them, or at least tried to.
Yeah, so for the first handful of stories that we had reported on, we had obviously reached out to the Saudi embassy in Washington, and the Saudi consulate in Los Angeles was the entity that had provided bail money for many of the defendants here in Oregon. So we tried reaching out to individuals at the consulate there. Never heard anything from them until two U.S. senators, both from Oregon, Ron Wyden and Jeff Merkley, introduced legislation in Congress as sort of a direct response to the findings in our reporting. Essentially, the bills would seek to punish Saudi Arabia if it was found that the government itself had played a role in helping some of these individuals escape prosecution. At that point, we started hearing from the Saudi embassy in Washington, and have heard from them a couple of times since then. The gist of what we've been told, and it's mostly been pretty short, structured statements, is that they have said that the Saudi embassy, as a policy, will provide bail money and legal services to any citizen accused of crimes in the United States who asks for help, but have categorically denied that they've played any role whatsoever in facilitating the departure of individuals from the U.S. back to Saudi Arabia.
Now, as soon as you're talking about private planes, unless these are planes that are, I don't know, contracted by the parents of these students, doesn't that directly imply that the Saudi government is doing more than just bail money and legal services?
I mean, I think that's a question best asked to federal law enforcement investigators who sort of are working with that theory right now. I think the more important thing to kind of point out with the case of Nura, who again was the Saudi national here in Portland who killed a 15-year-old girl, and a number of other cases here in Oregon, and then in other parts of the U.S. and in Canada, a number of these students, as a condition for their release from jail when they were bailed out, were required to turn their passports over to authorities. Now, that could have been the Department of Homeland Security or the court administrative officer in a particular jurisdiction or other authorities. So a number of these students have managed to leave the United States and return to Saudi Arabia without a passport. So the question there is, how are they able to travel when their travel documents have been seized? And I think that's the particular detail, more so than the private plane or the prospect of a private plane, that really raises the question with how the heck are these guys getting out of the country if they don't have a passport?
So you've laid out what the initial sort of pieces or steps in your investigation has been and who you've talked to. What's going on now, and what's sort of your next step or focus in all of this?
Absolutely. So this has certainly gotten the attention of Senators Wyden and Merkley, who have been raising sort of a stink in Washington the last couple of weeks, or more so the last couple of months. Obviously, they've introduced bills into Congress. Senator Wyden, who sits on the Select Committee on Intelligence in the Senate, asked Christopher Wray, the FBI director, in an open committee hearing a month ago what the FBI knew about these types of cases, and asked if the FBI could report back to him about any involvement the Saudi government may have had in facilitating the departure of these criminal defendants or other ones. Senator Merkley yesterday, who's on the Foreign Relations Committee, was sort of asking the Trump nominee for ambassador to Saudi Arabia about these cases. And after weeks of sort of raising questions, it sounds like a federal investigation or a kind of probe is underway, where a number of agencies, including Customs and Border Protection, the Department of Justice, and possibly the State Department, are now looking into these disappearances, or at least have told Senators Wyden and Merkley that they're doing so.
So the last thing I wanted to touch on was you've looked at Saudi nationals and sort of what has happened there. Is there any other country where there has been a sort of similar disappearance of people charged with crimes where it's possible that the government was involved in some way?
That's a really great question, and it's an important one, and it's one I think we hope to seek to answer a little later down the line. Certainly, we've been asked the question over and over again, why are you focusing sort of exclusively on Saudi Arabia at this time? And it's simply because the first case we dealt with, and we thought we were dealing with just one unusual incident here in Portland, involved a Saudi national. And then once we found that there were 5 here in Oregon, we decided we're going to start looking around the country. And that's something we're still doing now, is looking for other cases, and we're actually finding them and finding some other interesting things along the way. But, clearly this hasn't been sort of an attempt to single out Saudi Arabia in particular. But since they are a close ally of the United States, because they don't have an extradition treaty with us, we've been very intent on looking at this particular country. And also because there's been a number of questions sort of raised within recent months about, the U.S.-Saudi relations in the aftermath of the killing of journalist Jamal Khashoggi, the war in Yemen, and other sort of conduct by the Saudi Arabian government abroad. So that sort of fits into that larger context as well. But going back to your question, obviously we want to sort of figure out who else, from other parts of the world might be participating in similar ventures.
Really excellent work. We've been speaking with Dixon Kavanaugh, who's a staff reporter with the Oregonian in Portland. We're going to keep following the story, Shane, and I appreciate you sharing it with our audience.
Dave, thanks so much for having me on today.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
There's currently lots of confusion and debate over who is a socialist, and this has become super prominent in right-wing political discourse as of late. You might remember that at the latest State of the Union address, Donald Trump even loudly proclaimed that the United States is never going to be a socialist country. And I want to dig into this today. First of all, as I've said before, Trump can't actually control whether the U.S. ever becomes a socialist country, and he can't control what happens after his presidency. But the most important reaction to have when Trump loudly proclaims that is that there's no big clamoring for actual socialism from anyone in power in the United States. The furthest left ideas that are prominent in the U.S. from elected officials are socially democratic ideas, with the tiniest sprinkling of people in Congress who actually are open to the idea of socializing the means of production. But basically, the furthest left ideas that are part of the dialogue are social democratic ideas. Number two, to very, very crudely summarize it, socialism sort of split off in the late 19th century. One direction was the Stalinist-Leninist line, which became communistic. And then there's the social democracy line, which became most prominently early or late in the 19th century, the Swedish Social Democratic Party. But that doesn't actually matter, because this is a known tactic. The tactic is smear as communist anything that is socially democratic. That's the tactic that we've seen for a very long time. Edward Herman and Noam Chomsky write about this in their 1988 book, Manufacturing Consent. We have to be able to really think about this. We have to separate our personal beliefs from factual history. As people know, I'm not a communist, but I'm acknowledging that communism has been smeared as a propaganda method dating all the way back to the early 20th century in the United States. And the reason that this can happen, the reason that social democracy can be smeared under the umbrella of communism, is because a lot of people don't really understand what social democracy is versus socialism versus communism. So it's a tactic that works really, really well. I don't want to give a full history lesson here, and we've gone into the differences between socialism and communism and social democracy. But what you have to understand is that most of the American left is not socialist, and it's also not communist to the extent that they even know the differences between those ideologies and social democracy. Because the right accuses people like me, social democrats, of being communists or socialists, we immediately end up on the defensive. We on the left end up having to defend what is socialism or communism. We end up mishandling it. We end up sounding sometimes like the anti-communist reactionaries that have been in the United States since the early 20th century, when no one's actually talking about communism. So it's a really good tactic that the right uses. It's a brilliant smear. You say, hey, you know what? We could learn a lot from the healthcare system of the UK or from Canada or Sweden or Switzerland. And in comes the right and they say, that is a communist idea, that's a socialist idea. The next part of the conversation, when someone says, let's see how we can improve our healthcare system, the next part of the conversation should be, you know what, we should discuss, is Medicare for all the best path forward? Or would we be better off with a nationalized care delivery system and a nonprofit health insurance apparatus? Or would the German system be better than the Swiss system? Or what elements of the Canadian system would be good? That's the way the conversation should go. You often can't even get there because in comes the right saying that's socialist, that's communist, it's a government takeover, it's anti-American. And what the left ends up having to do, or ends up doing anyway, is arguing about whether healthcare for all is socialist. It's the wrong debate. It has worked for 100 years. It fragments the left, particularly because it makes the small portion of the left that is actually socialistic come out and say, we are socialists and that's a good thing. That's not the majority of the left. The demonization of communism might not really seem important to social democrats because we're not communists, but it's very damaging because it creates this sort of false dichotomy between communists and anti-communists. The reality is there's no threat of communism in the United States. Social democrats who believe in a mixed economy and healthcare for all don't think about communism very much. What we're talking about is modernizing our basic systems the way that many rich countries have done. But when they draw the line as either you're a communist or you're an anti-communist, it makes the left split and it makes the left start to sound like reactionaries, and we end up losing. So there's two sides to this. Number one, we should accept that either way, they are going to smear social democratic ideas as communist ideas. These are capitalist ideas. They exist in capitalist systems, whether it's universal health care, tuition-free college, living wages. They will say these are communist ideas. They are not. We should expect that, and we should know how to deal with it. But the one word of caution to the left is we also shouldn't help them out by saying we are democratic socialists when we are social democrats. There's a number of elected officials in the Democratic Party that have made this mistake. They call themselves democratic socialists when they are not. That makes it easier for the right to fracture the left, for the right to smear the left as socialist. Let's not make it easier for them. Let's call ourselves social democrats if that's what we are. If you're a socialist, by all means, call yourself a socialist. There's no advantage to using the term democratic socialist if it doesn't actually apply. It just makes the right smear tactics more effective. But understand, this has been going on for a very, very long time, and we should not fall for it. Okay, so I finalized my business taxes over the weekend and then my personal taxes, and I got a much bigger refund than I did last year. Of course, the refund size doesn't really matter because your withholdings can change. What matters is your effective tax rate. My effective tax rate is way down. Okay, my effective federal tax rate for the 2017 tax year was 26.2%. My effective tax rate for the 2018 tax year, which I just filed, is only 22.9%. My tax rate effective has dropped on the basis of the Donald Trump tax plan by about 13%. This is a really big tax cut that I got. Now, what did I do to earn that tax cut? Nothing. I didn't do anything. The David Pakman Show grew in 2018, not insignificantly, and yet my effective tax rate went down by almost 13%. Now, the reasons why this happened, it's a combination of some deductions that are available to businesses that are structured with pass-through income, combined with some changes to the brackets and the code and other deductions. The specifics don't really matter, but the point is, the David Pakman Show grew in 2018. My effective tax rate dropped 13%. I got an actual, real, significant tax cut. So let's ask the question, is this good for the economy? Let's explore that, because the right says it's good to give tax cuts to businesses because they will produce more, they will hire more people, and it's going to be a big, big win for everybody. It's just not true. I mean, it's just not true. My effective tax rate dropped from 26 to 22%. Am I going to go hire more people now? Of course not. I hire people based on demand. I hire people on the basis of whether I have work for them to do. But here's the really important thing. If I can take profits at 22% instead of at 26% tax, I am incentivized not to invest in my business. Okay, this is like just a key thing to understand. I talked about this with Dave Rubin when he was on the show, and it wasn't clear that he understood it. If I can earn profit and pay 26% or earn profit and pay 22%, what do I choose? I choose 22%. The lower effective tax rate is an incentive for me not to invest in the business. Remember, if I invest in the business, I lower the adjusted income. That saves me more if the tax rate is higher. I am more incentivized to reinvest in my business if there is a higher effective tax rate. It's just a fundamental backwards element of the entire right-wing view around taxation. This year, I paid 13% less on the profit that the business earned. It's an incentive not to reinvest. There's no economically defensible reason for my tax rate to have dropped 13%, despite the fact that the David Pakman Show grew. And this applies to so many of the businesses that we are told, if we just cut their taxes, it's going to be great for the economy. It's going to be good for everybody. It's going to lead to hiring. It's going to pump money into the economy. It's not. I wasn't planning on that tax return. I am not spending on the assumption that I am getting that tax refund, not return. And it's simply not better for the economy. Now, you might say, David, well, then just send in more money to the federal government. That's not tax policy. Me choosing to pay 26% instead of 22%, that's not policy. That's not money that the government has budgeted for. It's not money that would be used in any productive way when it's not actually expected to be tax revenues on the basis of a broader tax plan. Me sending in more money is just one of those ridiculous right-wing sort of libertarian-ish cartoonish ideas. Doesn't make sense, but case in point, why these tax cuts for corporations are not good for the economy. We have a voicemail number. That number is 219-2-DAVID-P. Here's something funny. A caller says that despite my education, I still don't know anything. Take a listen.
I have watched your program about socialism doesn't work. In spite of all of your education, you are an ignorant twit. Thank you. Bye.
Right. Listen, there is no question that having an education does not necessarily make you smart. I think Trump going to UPenn is sort of the number one example of that. So I agree with the framing of this caller that just having education doesn't guarantee that you're going to be an intelligent and well-informed person, but that's not really an argument against what I actually said in whatever video about socialism they're referring to. I don't even know what video they're talking about. We've got a great bonus show for you today. I will tell you why I am not in the studio today, what's coming up on the program in the next few weeks, and much, much more. Become a member, become a patron, and you'll get instant access to the bonus show.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.